Hello and welcome to The Big Conversation live on UK Low Carb Podcast. We are live on YouTube, Facebook and low carb groups here and all around the world. You can take part by sharing your thoughts using the hashtag UK Low Carb on Twitter and Instagram. Now, this is the podcast where we share individual stories, and we have shows like this as well to help build the low carb and keto community, not just here in the UK, but also around the world. I'm your host, Dan Grief, and I believe that change comes from grassroots movements and that we are the change we want to see in the world. Today, I'm joined by our four amazing guests on The Big Conversation. Our first guest today is Dr. Jen Unwin. Dr. Jen is a retired consultant. She's a clinical health psychologist who helps people with food addictions into recovery. She's also the author of the book Fork in the Road. All of the book's proceeds go to the Public Health Collaboration. Welcome to the show, Dr. Jen Unwin.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
Wonderful to have you back on the show, Jen. We're also joined today by Professor Tim Noakes.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Welcome to the show, Prof. Tim. You have been very much missed from the show for the last couple of weeks, but it's great to have you here. Now, I'm sure you know Prof. Tim already, but let me just tell you that Prof. Noakes is an athlete who's published more than 750 scientific books and articles. His publications include bestsellers and The Real Meal Revolution. He's also the founder of the Noakes Foundation, the focus of which is to raise funds to help support quality research into nutrition. Welcome to the show, Prof. Noakes.
Thank you, Dan. Lovely to be with you again.
Great stuff. And our next guest is Pauline Cox.
Hello.
Now, Pauline is a nutritionist with a key interest in metabolic health. She particularly use of healthy ketogenic approach to improving healthy and longer lives. Welcome to the show, Pauline.
Hi, great to be here, Dan.
Great to have you on as well, Pauline. And you, of course, were on the show last week, so it's good to have you back on. We also are joined by Dr. David Unwin. Now, Dr. Unwin is an award-winning GP, and not only does he save the NHS almost £60,000 a year, but has improved the lives of hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people, by empowering them out of their medication dependency through changing their way of eating to the low-carb way of life. Welcome to the show, Dr. David Unwin.
Hello, I'm super excited to see what we're going to get up to over the next couple of hours.
Fantastic stuff. And before I start, I just want to make this point very clear. We're not giving medical advice. None of these guests are your doctor. This is just an interesting piece of information from each of them that we think that you would like to know. Welcome to the show, everyone. Let's start our big conversation. Welcome, everyone, to the show. Now, we're just going to start by going through each of my guests. The guests will share an article that they've actually told us about previously, and we will start in a moment with Jen Unwin. Each of the guests will then share this information with you and then give us a bit of a précis as to what the information says, and then we're going to debate it between us. If, however, you want to be part of the big conversation, you'll notice we have the hashtag UK Low Carb, so you can actually put your tweets, you can actually comment on the Facebook pages as well, and we will try and share some of these throughout this episode, so you can be part of this as well. But I'm now going to hand over to Jen Unwin. Jen, you're going to do your presentation on food addiction and mental health in adolescence, a systematic review. So over to you, Dr. Jen Unwin.
Thanks so much. Yes, this is a paper that's just come out really recently, only in the last couple of weeks or so, and I thought this would be an interesting one to discuss because it raises a number of issues that I'm interested in, and I think are really important clinically, if you like, and just some really interesting themes coming out of it. So it's an Australian team. They've done a review of food addiction in adolescents, and particularly with an interest as well as the links with mental health. They did quite a sort of systematic search, but ended up with 27 studies and did what's called a narrative review because they couldn't really sort of amalgamate the data. They had to sort of just look at it and give us some sort of themes and results that came out of it. So most of the studies that they looked at used an instrument called the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which is, to be honest, really practically the one and only validated measure of food addiction symptoms. So they were able to find 25 studies using that measure. Some of them use the version for children, which is a slightly adapted version that uses language that's suitable for children. And the YFAS, as it's more simply called, is based on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual criteria for substance use disorders. So many people will know that food addiction isn't actually recognized as a sort of distinct disorder yet in either the DSM or the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases, which the WHO put out. So they took the criteria that you might use for, let's say, alcohol misuse or drug misuse, and apply that to food. So it's a very commonly used measure in the field. There are a number of kind of really interesting findings. There's the main one really is that food addiction had rates up to about 50% in adolescents who were seeking clinical help for eating disorder problems. And it also seems to co-occur with mental health problems like anxiety and depression and eating disorders, but also is higher in adolescents with obesity and poor quality of life and poor self-esteem. One interesting finding was that the symptoms seem to be slightly less severe than they are in adults. So those are the kind of headlines. And then the important points for me were, I've got a number of important points that I wanted to sort of throw up for discussion, if you like. The first is that the findings from the paper seem to really support what we see clinically, you know, when you're working with people with food addiction. There seems to be a very early onset and then a worsening, and as it doesn't kind of get better over time, it gets worse over time. When you talk to people about their histories with food, they tend to start really young. They often worsen in adolescence because that's the time when they have the independence and the money to go and buy their own foods, or, you know, be getting their own foods. So that certainly ties in with the stories that I hear, that symptoms develop and worsen over time. So that ties in with this idea that the symptoms seem to be slightly worse in this, better in this group than they are when you look at the adult research. But I think that's just because people are getting worse over time. There's this strong link with mental health problems in adolescence, and also obviously later on so clinically you often see people start with a food addiction. It's almost like a gateway drug, as we would say, that kids have access to sugar. You know, I believe that's a psychoactive substance, and that worsens with time. But also then, you know, there's evidence from other literature that then links into problems with other addictions, like alcohol, for example, but also other drugs. There's definitely evidence for that. It also supports what we see clinically in that there's more females tend to have food addiction problems, or at least come forwards with them, and that's supported in the paper. And is also in clinical practice, you see a lot of people struggling with weight problems and food addiction. So again, that's, you know, that's sort of backed up by this paper. They mention in the study that, of course, there are no clinical services for either adolescents or adults actually with food addiction problems. And that's partly because it's not recognized as a distinct disorder, because that's how services tend to get funded, is that we recognize that people have a problem with alcohol addiction, then services and research will be funded. So part of the important issue here is that food addiction hasn't yet been recognized officially as a diagnosis. So there aren't services to address it. So a lot of young people are either going to end up in mental health services who won't recognize this as a problem. And certainly when I worked in mental health services, there wasn't an interest in nutrition at all. So that definitely needs to change. Or they'll end up in an eating disorder service. And currently, as far as I know, most of the eating disorder services are based on the idea of eating everything in moderation and some cognitive behavior therapy. That's the sort of model that that they have. So anyone whose actual problem is food addiction will not get appropriate diagnosis and treatment. So for me, that's a big issue. Really an overlapping issue is this close association in adolescence between eating disorders and food addiction. And that's also been found in the adult studies that have been done. So in this paper, where there were 7 out of 8 studies which found a really strong correlation between binge eating disorder and food addiction. And I've seen rates reported in adult studies of over 90% overlap. So people with binge eating disorder also being diagnosable with food addiction. And 9 out of 10 studies in this paper found a strong correlation between depression and anxiety and food addiction problems. So it's a massive problem. Another interesting thing that came out was they mentioned about impulsivity, and that what you find in the adolescents being seeming to have food addiction problems tended to have higher scores on impulsivity measures. But I've seen that in adult studies as well. But I question the direction of that relationship, because we know that the way that sugar acts on the brain is to sort of dampen down the activity in the frontal region of the brain, which is where we have sort of impulse control. And I'm not sure whether it's that impulsive people become food addicts, or that sugar and refined carbohydrates dampen down our ability to have control and become more impulsive. And that's the sort of study that needs to be done and would need to be done, obviously, as a sort of following up people who were in treatment for food addiction, for example. So the size of the problem is enormous. And if you take a sort of a reasonable population estimate of about 8%, which is the same, it turned out about the same in adolescents as it would in adults, that's 4.3 million adults in the UK that would have a food addiction problem. It's a huge problem. And I was really pleased to see that they were saying that there's been a lot of the papers that they reviewed, the 27 were very recent. So there's obviously more and more interest. And I've seen that. I did a bit of a literature review of the adult literature, and the numbers of papers being published every year is going up more or less exponentially in this field. So I'm hopeful that the tide is turning and that this will be recognized as a condition, and that will make a massive difference, as I say, to services being available to people, and more research being funded. And the last point I wanted to make before we sort of go on to a broader discussion about the paper was that I was that teenager. I was that teenager overeating sugar and not being able to stop, which was the main symptom that these adolescents described, was that they wanted to quit but weren't able to. And that was me, and it took me over 30 years to find low carb and find the answer. So that's why I'm so passionate about this topic, and I really think we need to help people early and help families early to because prevention is way better than cure. So that's me, and I'm interested to hear what people made of it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Jen. A really powerful article. I just want to let everybody know, if you want to read these articles that my guests are sharing today, there is a link that I think Josh, my assistant, can put out to everyone. And on that link, you'll see the connection to all of those 4 articles. So you can read these for yourselves. Brilliantly presented there, Jen. Really, really accessible. And now really is the time when we come to the rest of the panel. Would anyone like to make any comments or anything they want to say? David, over to you.
Yeah. A comment and then a question. I'd just like to share with the viewers really how difficult it is for clinicians, so that I can get help for somebody with gambling addiction and there isn't even a substance. So I can refer you and help you with that. I can help you with nicotine addiction. I can help you with alcohol addiction.
Yeah.
But actually, I know in clinical practice that particularly for people who are very heavy, a large number of those people have actually got some kind of food addiction if you look for it. And it's interesting, I didn't look for it for years and years. But if you ask people, they'll tell you that I know my problem is bread, or all sorts of things I've been told. And I remember one lady who I'd looked after for 30 years, weighed somewhere over 25 stone. And she burst into tears because it was the first time she had ever confessed to anybody that her problem was bread, that she couldn't just manage moderation. The odd slice of bread, she said, it's half a loaf at a time. And I feel the cruelty of it, I think, is it makes people feel like idiots when they're not, because they're so ashamed, because it's not even an illness. So they feel, oh, I lack willpower. And yet, just like somebody with an alcohol problem or a gambling problem, what they need is support and to understand. So really, it's just, as a clinician, it's so frustrating. If it's not recognized as an illness, there are no clinics. And there are huge numbers of people around the world who have no help at all. And yes, it's true, there are, I have been shouted down in meetings by other doctors who say, but food addiction doesn't exist, David. And so I'm sad. It is for clinicians. But then go on, Jen.
No, I was just going to say, I think the tide is turning, and well, I hope it's recognized. I think it will be recognized in our lifetimes. I think it's just so difficult because there's so many vested interests to get against the recognition of it. And just so that people know, the public health collaboration in the UK is very close to David and I's hearts, and we've got a new subcommittee there looking at food addiction, and we're going to be campaigning and advocating for recognition of this condition and for research. And myself and a few colleagues are starting a clinical study where we're just doing a practical thing, a bit like David and I've done, really, where we're providing group treatment for people who self-identify with food addiction, and we're seeing how we can get on with treating them in groups and what kind of outcomes we get. So do get in touch via the PHC if you're interested, and please support the work of the PHC if you're interested and feel passionate about this topic.
Wonderful. Just before I come to you, Pauline, and I will certainly, I just want to say it's interesting what you just said there about the fact that gambling is identified as an addiction without a substance. So in a way, you think it'd be an easier thing to say that food can be an addiction. But I was just going to say on that point, though, Jen, when you're talking about food addictions generally and how many people, what about the breakdown of types of food? Because that's the thing that I think, just like you said, people are addicted to bread. I don't know anyone who's addicted to sausages, or, well, maybe they are, but I've never heard of it, or steak or bacon. Yeah. So, what about the types of food and what's research into that?
Nicole Avina published a really good paper, I'm sure it was her, on the sort of things that people report. So people who score as food addicts, and what sort of things do they struggle most with? Yeah, you're exactly right. It's all the kinds of usual suspects that we know about: pizza, donuts, bread, crisps, chocolate. So sugary, fatty, salty. The only one that came up reasonably high on the list, number 10, was cheese. That was would maybe surprise some people, but actually, when you work with people with food addiction, cheese is often a trigger, actually, and something that they can't moderate. It's often something that people do have to kind of quit or be extremely careful with in the end if they have this tendency. So they tend to be the Nova 4 foods that we've all been hearing about recently, the ultra processed foods, and the highly sugary, refined carbohydrate foods that people struggle with. Yeah, like you say, not broccoli on the whole, or eggs.
Yeah. Pauline, did you want to come in with some comments on that?
That food. Can you hear me?
I can now. Sorry.
You can. Okay. I think it's really important that people understand the influence that the foods that they choose have on their hormones and their biochemistry, because it's not something we're educated about. And it almost becomes too late by the time we've really garnered an appetite for these highly processed foods, the damage has already been done. And that feedback system, that drive to keep eating, when we consume these highly processed foods, I mean, it literally has a damaging effect on the satiety hormones produced within our gut that then have a direct communication with our brain. And we just have this drive to continue eating. And, you know, our drive to eat is there as a human survival tool. You know, it's there to help us evolve and survive. But when those communications start to become disrupted, and as David pointed out, you know, people think that it's them and they're greedy, they have no willpower, they have no self-control. It's absolutely not. It's fundamentally down to fighting your biochemistry and things becoming completely disrupted from a ghrelin perspective, from a CCK, which is our satiety hormone. And our bodies are in this state of foraging for essential fats and essential amino acids. And when these particular neurons within the gut become damaged and retracted into the mucosal membrane, we are not producing that satiety hormone. And so we are just driven to keep eating until we are supposed to get this trigger to say, I have the fats I need, I have the amino acids I need. And it's disrupting this very beautiful, intricate system that's going on in the body that we then see as our own fault and an issue we have with willpower.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think providing that information to people and that explanation is actually liberating. So, you know, people often say, oh, isn't it stigmatizing to say, you know, it's an addiction? That's one of the arguments that's been made against it. I saw someone was asking what are the arguments that are made against acknowledging that you can have a food and a sugar addiction. They did some work. It was a really lovely study looking at if you showed somebody a picture of an obese person and you gave them an explanation, which was sort of, you know, they need to eat less and move more, or if you gave them a picture of an obese person and you gave them an explanation of, you know, certain foods can be addictive, they act in this way in the brain. People were much more sympathetic to the person with the addiction explanation, which makes complete sense to me. And you feel more sympathetic to yourself and kind of angry about the you know, what's got you to this point, because as you say, our brains and our guts have been hijacked, really. Dopamine's a really major part of it. And once you explain the brain rewiring to people, they understand it, and it helps them to sort of have that knowledge and motivation to be abstinent from those foods. Because once they've understood the damage that they do, they can, it's not easy, but they can more easily make some choices and put some things in place in their environment to support, you know, staying abstinent, basically. Because, you know, abstinence is the treatment for addiction. We all know that works. Yes. And if you just take the model of alcohol, you know, you wouldn't ask an alcoholic to moderate. You wouldn't even think of it. So if we just take that same model, and it really works for people, you know, they really understand that, and it really makes a difference. And as David says, the support part is really important. And again, we know that in addiction, we know that, you know, AA and, you know, all of these kind of support groups are really essential to keep people in long-term recovery. I totally agree with you, Pauline. The earlier, the better. The less rewiring that's gone on. I mean, a lot of the viewers will watch the Chris Telecom program where he ate junk food for a month, and they literally showed on the scans the rewiring of his brain, which hadn't reversed even 6 weeks later when he'd stopped eating it. You know, you do some kind of pretty serious rewiring, and that's why symptoms get worse over time. It's why it's hard to be abstinent. But once you're abstinent, you know, it's really important to stick to that, because the minute you relapse, you're back way worse, exactly like an alcoholic, because the brain's lighting up, the dopamine system goes wild. And they've shown that in animal studies as well, that it's much worse to have abstinence and then access, where you do that with in the animal studies, they go crazy when they have intermittent access. So this is the problem in a way, that it's how you get into the sort of binge eating problems, is that people try and deny themselves, then they crack, and then they binge, because that's the natural biological process. Like you were saying, Pauline, that's the process it's the fundamental sort of survival process, to binge. And then all the guilt and the problems that come after that, and then they will try restriction again. So I think, again, explaining that to people so that they understand, abstinence has to be abstinence if you've once got a problem. If you can't moderate it, you have to abstain.
Totally agree. Do you want to say, Tim, did you want to come in there in the conversation?
Yeah, I just fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, both of you. Really amazing. So my opinion is that obesity equals food addiction. And I think if we would address it like that, we can start making progress. All the people that I've helped, they tell you how they've got rid of controlling the addiction. I spoke to a guy in America who'd lost 400 pounds. I'm not sure how many stones that is. 400 pounds. And I asked him, so tell me, what was it like when you weighed 600 plus pounds? And he said, I could eat a massive meal, and within 30 minutes, I was starving again, and I would have to eat more. And it was interesting that he then went low carbs, lots of fat, and he solved the issues, and he lost all the weight. But until we recognize that food addiction is the key driver of obesity, every day we read, we don't know what causes obesity. It's either low, CISO or calories in, calories out, or we don't know. It's too complex. And that's nonsense. And key to it all is sugar. And I'm beginning to realize, and I'll address this again, that sugar is the real driver of the problem. And in a sense, the low carb movement, we've made one error. Sugar as being the key driver of so much damage. Of course, it's processed foods, etc. But what changed in our nutrition was sugar. It wasn't the wheat, and it wasn't the rice. They're not helpful, but it was the sugar that was the real start of the problem. And I'll come back to that later.
Excellent point. Yeah, thank you for that.
I'll just make one point, which is that you can get normal weight food addicts. So yes, I think in and we've definitely seen it, haven't we, David? In the people who have really big struggles with weight, we've had people who've lost 9 stone, 8 stone, 10, they do. So quite right, where people have big struggles with obesity, then there's often a food addiction issue. But you can get normal weight food addicts as well. I know 1 or 2. Go on, David.
Yeah, just quick point, David, because you have to move on in a moment,
quick.
if that's okay.
The other point, there are underweight food addicts, because I'm beginning to see a clinical thing, which is very thin children, and they are so picky. They will only eat sugary this and sugary that, and their mothers are begging and pleading, and they're not getting enough protein. So that thinking about it, it covers a very wide gamut. But the most worrying ones are these almost malnourished children I'm seeing, very thin, hardly having any protein or any vegetables, because they will only have sugary foods, and the parents are beside themselves, not knowing how to handle that.
Yeah, very good point. And that is a shocking truth of our the problems are going to be in the next 10, 20 years when those children grow into being adults. You suddenly think, what's going to be the outcome for them then? Thank you so much for that, Dr. Jen. That is a superb article. Great start to the show. But unfortunately, we'd have to move on. But that's also positive, because now we're going to go over to Professor Tim Noakes. And your paper today is the association of lipid, inflammatory and metabolic biomarkers with age at onset for incident coronary heart disease in women. So without much further ado, over to you, Tim Noakes.
Thanks, Dan. Because I'm such a humble person, I didn't give you the really important paper that we really should be discussing. And this is this one, which lovely long title. And it's titled Hiding Unhealthy Heart Outcomes in a Low-Fat Diet Trial. The Women's Health Initiative Randomized Controlled Dietary Modification Trial finds that postmenopausal women with established coronary heart disease were at increased risk of an adverse outcome if they consumed a low-fat, heart-healthy diet. And the only reason we're not discussing it is because I'm the author, and I'm really proud that this, which I've been working on for a couple of years, probably 10 years, I finally managed to get it published. And it was through, when I was writing this, that I came across the article of today. So let me just give you a little bit of background. Why am I so interested in the Women's Health Initiative? Now, we've got to differentiate the Women's Health Initiative from the Women's Heart Study. They're two separate studies. When I was excommunicated by my university, they invited the person who was the head of the Women's Health Initiative to come and debate me. And he said Noakes is wrong because Noakes says it's diabetes that is causing heart disease, and we all know it's cholesterol. And on that grounds, everything happened to me. But in the debate I had with this professor, I showed how they'd hidden evidence for harm in the Women's Health Initiative study. They had hidden evidence that women who had previous heart disease and went on the low-fat, heart-healthy diet were at 26%, that's correct, increased risk of heart disease during the study that would lasted 8 years. And they managed to hide it. They hid the data. And I exposed that during the debate, but it was like it didn't matter because, I was obviously so wrong. A few weeks, about 4 months ago, I decided I wonder where the Women's Health Initiative is today. And I went and looked at the literature and I found 2 new papers. And what they've shown is that now that 26% increased risk of heart attack has increased to 60%. 60% increased risk of a subsequent heart attack if you had coronary heart disease in these women and you ate the low-fat diet. And they hid it again. And they used explanations to try to hide it. They were so successful that the final paper from the Women's Health Initiative doesn't even discuss the people who had started the trial with heart disease. It ignores them. And so it only takes the healthy people and shows that they do okay on the diet. They don't do marvelously. So what my paper, which is coming out in Open Heart hopefully in a few weeks' time, shows the distortion of that, how they hid the data, and how it's unbelievable that the paper was published, that without properly people getting to grips with it. So anyway, I was almost finished with that article when I came across the study that we're looking at today. And I initially made the error. I thought it was from the Women's Health Initiative. And I thought, amazing. The Women's Health Initiative has been able to disprove the Women's Health Initiative. But unfortunately, it wasn't. It was the Women's Health Study. And the Women's Health Initiative is an NIH-funded study, and it used multiple centers. But the study we're talking about today, the Women's Heart Study, comes from Harvard. And the lead author, not of this article, but the lead author of the Women's Heart Study was a great friend of mine, and she was trained by one of the great epidemiologist, Dr. Ralph Paffenbarger, who I was very closely associated with, and we ran a marathon together, and so we were great friends. But the Women's Heart Study begins as a study to see if increasing aspirin or increasing vitamin E will prevent heart disease in these women. They weren't postmenopausal, they were perfectly healthy women, and many of them were physicians in the greater area of Boston and so on. And they followed them now, and they found that vitamin E made no difference and aspirin made no difference. But they had fortunately measured all the so-called risk factors for heart disease in 1993. An amazing array of 50 different markers. And they then followed these women through till 2020. So from 1993 to 2020. So it was a fantastic follow-up. And what did they find? They found that there's the 2 factors that predict heart attack risk in these women is diabetes and insulin resistance, and that's it. It's astonishing. Even smoking is not anywhere near as strong a risk factor as diabetes. So for me, this literally is one of the most important papers in the field. But did anyone hear about it? Did you hear about it? Was it reported in The Guardian? No. Or The Telegraph? No. Because it conflicts so with the theory that it's the low-fat diet is helping us. So in very brief summary, if we look at the hazard ratios, and they tell us how probable there might be a relationship between this variable that we've measured and the outcome. So a hazard ratio, Walter Willett at Harvard, if he sees a hazard ratio of 1.1, he says that's significant, which of course is nonsense. We normally take a hazard ratio above 2, which kind of starts to suggest that the two variables might be related. In this study, the relationship between heart attack or coronary heart disease and diabetes was hazard ratio of 10. That is, it's out of the ballpark. It is just unbelievable. And metabolic syndrome had a hazard ratio of 6. Hypertension was 4.6. Obesity was 4.3. And smoking was only 3.9. So insulin resistance and diabetes have a greater risk for causing heart disease than smoking. And the marker in the blood that predicts heart attack risk was not LDL cholesterol. That had a hazard ratio of 1.4, which is meaningless, 1.4. But they came up with a thing that they measured called the lipoprotein insulin resistance score. And how could they have come up with this score in 1993? I don't know. But what they did was they took their blood and they put it under a magnetic resonance machine, and they measured the size of the particles of many of the lipoproteins. It wasn't just the LDL particles, it was VLDL and HDL. And they then come up with this lipoprotein score, which they show is the best predictor of insulin resistance. And the hazard ratio for the lipoprotein insulin resistance score was 6 point something, which is also astronomical. So this is an incredibly important paper, because let's just again remind you that this is one of the key points of the paper. Of more than 50 factors examined, diabetes and lipoprotein insulin resistance had the highest relative risk, particularly for premature coronary heart disease. And then their meaning, this is what they interpret, what the study means. Risk profile appears to differ by age at coronary heart disease onset in women, with the greatest risk for premature events associated with diabetes and insulin resistance. And there you are. And I'm just going to finish up because I want to bring in the sugar story. So there's a fabulous book that's just been published called Ravenous, Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. This is an astonishing book. You must read it, because the author, who again is one of these brilliant investigative journalists like Nina Teicholz and Gary Taubes, he comes to the conclusion that sugar, and fructose particularly, is the key driver for cancer. And it's an amazing story how he takes Otto Warburg, the Second World War, the persecution of the Jews, how he takes that and puts it together in a package. And it's an amazing book. You just read it, you can't put it down. And he comes to the conclusion that diet is driving cancer. And not only that, it's carbohydrates. That's the one book. You need then go back to read Gary Taubes and the Case Against Sugar. And finally, the book that I've had in my bookshelf for a long time, The Saccharine Disease by T.L. Cleave, one of the classic books, 1974. And I was reading last night his chapter on coronary heart disease, chapter 8, coronary heart disease. He says, it's all sugar, it's all diabetes causing coronary heart disease. And he draws this from observational epidemiology of how people's health differed. The people eating traditional foods, when the sugar arrives, that's the problem. The refined carbohydrates are a problem, but they were introduced long before the health deteriorated. It's when you add the sugar, that's the killer. So that's my message. We've underestimated the importance of sugar. And I'm trying to make the point that this article tells us that it's diabetes we should be worried about for heart disease. And I would argue that the diabetes is being driven by, in a major case, by sugar.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Tim. What an insight. I knew it was going to be an amazing panel, but I'm even blown away so far by what we've had from the two speakers so far. Just to let people know, and actually I need to let you know something as well, Tim. So Sam Apple is the author of Ravenous, and he heard our podcast together a few weeks ago, and he was so touched that you're reading his book that he's now said he'd like to come on the podcast and talk about these issues. So he's going to come on and talk about that book in particular. I'm going to get a copy for my bookshelf behind me, and I will read that for sure, including there are some great people up here already. Pauline, you're up there. Tim Noakes, you're up there. Nita Ty Schultz is coming on the show tomorrow. She's up there. Jen will be up there very soon. I'm waiting for David's book to go up there. So maybe one day soon, who knows? Or maybe my own little pamphlet alongside it all one day, who knows? But thank you. I just want to say then, anyone want to ask any questions? And then after we have this debate, we're just going to go to some of what the listeners and the viewers are saying today. And I'll tell them where they can get these articles to read for themselves. But over to you, David Unwin.
Yeah. Well, just to support what Tim has said, so I also was looking into the evidence for why we believe what we believe. And in my teaching, the Framingham study was one of the most famous studies for the idea that cholesterol was furring up your arteries. But I looked again at the Framingham study, and this is what I found, that they actually, the same team, published something on liver function. And they said here, the people with the top 25% or the worst liver function, the top or the worst quarter of liver function experienced a 67% increase in cardiovascular disease. And that means, you see, that liver function is far more important, far better predictor of what's going to happen to our patients than cholesterol itself. And they've known it, again, for a very long time. And we're all asking the question of, well, isn't it interesting, the silence on that? So much has been known for so long. And we seem to take a very long time to learn. But there it is, support from the Framingham study. Again, what Tim is saying, that it's about insulin resistance and it's about type 2 diabetes. And insulin resistance, you see, leads to fatty liver disease, which is now twice as many people as have diabetes. It's a quarter of the developed world. And so abnormal liver function is a call to arms. We need to do something. It's another pandemic, and we've known for so long.
Yeah, great. Jen?
Yeah, just to say that what I really love about the paper is that people often ask, when we're doing the low carb groups and so on, and you're talking about low carb, and people's main concern is around, it's always about cholesterol and heart attacks, isn't it? And that's what the families say to them. So what I love about this is it's just fantastic evidence that you can just share with people to say, well, no, actually, is the insulin resistance and the diabetes, which, this approach is going to help you with, that's going to make the big difference to you. So that's my big takeaway from it, is that from a practical point of view, the sort of reassurance that will give a lot of people.
Yeah, totally agree. What's interesting though, it's just like, so many of you have been in the field, so you're actually not dealing with this as an academic study. You're seeing this firsthand. So why is there so much resistance? When you actually say, like for instance, it seems like the canary giving us the warning sign is the liver, and yet we don't, and yet there's a lot of resistance here. Tim?
Well, it's the control of the sugar industry. It's as simple as that. In 1965, they funded Harvard to come out and say that sugar was safe and that high-fat diets caused heart disease, and that you could ignore triglycerides. They said, ignore triglycerides because it's all in the cholesterol. And they were paid a little bit of money, $50,000 today in today's money, and the two senior professors did it, and that was it. And then there's a formation of the International Life Sciences Institute, who is a front for Coca-Cola and for the sugar industry. And they were strongly involved in my trial. Absolutely. All the the key players who were against me have links to ILSI. So those are the issue. It's just that the sugar industry is so incredibly powerful. It drives or it controls what you're allowed to teach at medical schools, and it drives what dietitians are allowed to be taught. So it's sugar is all over this story.
Yeah. Jen.
And that's the same. It just links back into the food addiction story, that the major paper which argues against food addiction was funded by the Rip Institute, and Dr. Rip is funded by the corn refiners of America to the tune of some thousands of dollars every month. And in fact, if you just Google Rip in the New York Times, you'll see the whole story exposed. So I saw someone asking on the chat before about why this isn't recognized. It's just because there's lots of vested interest for food addiction, sugar addiction, not to be recognized as a problem. Sorry, Pauline, go ahead, because I know you had your hand up as well.
That's okay. I think there's also, we need to recognize the fact that pharmaceutical companies make billions of dollars out of statins, for one, and how interesting it is how they can do their statistical wizardry to promote statins as being this wonder drug that can save us all from cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease. And actually, research will show us that there's a 46% increase in insulin resistance when you're taking statins, which, how ironic. The very thing that will drive coronary heart disease is the thing that's been driven by the medication that we've been told to take to keep our hearts healthy. And 100 billion by one pharmaceutical company alone in statins. I think it's so important that the public understand that money is to be made out of sick care, and we have to take our own health into our hands.
I totally agree. The only thing is as well, I think that eventually this is going to break because national healthcare systems can't afford it and insurance companies can't afford it, or they're going to change their terms so that you don't really have any cover at all. And I think there's a natural breaking point, but I hope that we just save people before then, so they're aware, like you say, to take this into their own hands, because our healthcare systems can only patch up injury or ill health when it happens. They can't stop an unhealthy lifestyle from doing the damage in the first place. And I think you're completely right there, Pauline, in what you say. Thank you so much for that, Tim. That is an absolutely superb article there. Absolutely nothing wrong with sharing your own article as well. That's fine by me. So please do again. And if anyone else has done that on the show, that's absolutely fine, David. So I just want to say thank you so much for that. And before we go into our next speaker, just aware of the time, which is Pauline. Before we go across to you, Pauline, I just want to share some of the things that have been said. But before I do that, we have a link appearing on the screen now. That's my website, deliciouslyguiltfree.com. But if you go to that, you've got the links there. So you can either be watching this on YouTube, Facebook, and you've got the links for that. But also there's a link on that page where you can get all of these lovely articles to read for yourself. So if you go and have a look there, then that's the link for that there. Right, I'm just going to select then some of the lovely comments we've got. And can I just say, unlike any other sort of show, I think, on planet Earth, I know these people. They're my friends. And so it's lovely to see their names. So I want to say hello, Nicola Locke, who I know many of you know as well. Hi, also delighted to be here. Great to have you listening today, Nicola. Great to have you on board. We've got Roxy, who said how exciting, which is great. Thank you so much. That was left via Facebook. Jana in South Africa, who I feel like I'm becoming friends with now because I know her very well through Tim's team. Hi, everyone. Looking forward to this interesting discussion. Now, Joe says this, which I think is definitely true. What an awesome lineup. Thank you for that, Joe. And then I'm just going to get something here from Ken Armstrong, who's a great guy as well. And he has written this. I think this is on YouTube. Alas, there's still many practitioners who still don't believe food addiction is a thing, which I completely agree with. And Susie, oh, most certainly. And Susie Edge, of course, who's also an absolute legend. Why are there many people who dismiss the idea of food addiction? And how can I miss Yvonne Lane? Yvonne's here. I'd be up for helping with the PHC thing on food addiction. So there you go. And just actually, you don't just say, Jen, what's the PHC for those who might not have heard of it?
Yeah, public health collaboration, www.phcuk.org. Jump over and have a look. Yeah, so it's a UK charity trying to spread good nutrition advice. And as I say, we're going to get a sister website called Food Addiction Resources, coming very soon. Going to be lots of resources for the public, but also practitioners, and we'll be campaigning on some of these issues as well.
Fantastic. And Ken has said this, which I love. As you were talking there before, he's nodding madly in agreement, which is, I think, what we're all doing. So that's great. There's nobody actually on the other side of the argument. So I'll get a big pharmacy or big food corporate type in next time, maybe, and we'll see what happens. Yeah, that'll be naming no names. Okay, right. So in that case, I'm going to hand over to Pauline now. And her article is called "Can Ketones Help Rescue Brain Fuel Supply in Later Life? Implication for Cognitive Health During Aging and the Treatment of Alzheimer's Disease." Now, when I saw this, I was like, whoa, this is really a very good title. So I'll now hand over to you, Pauline.
Yeah, I would agree, Dan. I think it's a fascinating subject. And it was one I came across. I actually recently read a very interesting book by Mary Newport. And the book was a bit of a legacy to her husband, who had early onset Alzheimer's. And she was a medical doctor herself and was really trying to seek out the best treatment for him. But sadly for her, Steve was rapidly declining. The progression of his Alzheimer's was very rapid. And this was a guy, he was 51 at the time. He was an accountant. He had a very sharp brain, very physically active. However, the two of them, and she says this in her book, they were very typical of the standard American diet. She was a very busy consultant in a hospital. They both lived pretty much on ready meals. And she had very, very little understanding. I think she mentioned she had 3 hours of nutritional training during her medical training. And so had very little understanding of the link between diet and blood sugars and mental well-being and the potential for chronic illness. Anyway, so her husband, Steve, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, and there was nothing that she could do. She attempted to get him on a number of trials for various drugs, but at that point, the severity of his Alzheimer's had become so bad that he wasn't able to pass the first test to just enter onto the trial. Now, one of the really interesting things about her story was she documented his severity, if you like, through images of drawing clocks. Now, that's one of the tests that he failed to get onto the drugs trials. So he drew a clock, well, his version of a clock, which is just a few small dots and some random what looked like numbers on a sheet of paper. And he was told, and she was told that I'm afraid you won't get onto the drugs trial. Now, at the time, there was a medical food that was being trialed for helping with Alzheimer's. And she wanted to get him on that trial and she couldn't. So she wanted to find out what this medical food was and went on to a patenting website and did a little bit of investigative work and found out that it was a MCT-based food. And so she became very curious about this and began to research the brain and how Alzheimer's and the aging brain has a hypometabolic state. And what this means for the listeners is that the brain is unable to use glucose in the same manner that it would ordinarily. So there's a form of insulin resistance going on in the brain. And in such a way that the brain can't utilize glucose, but it can utilize ketones. So this really sparked her kind of interest into ketones and whether ketones could really unlock the neurons that could kind of reawaken and help the condition of Steve. So she decided to trial her own form of ketone therapy on Steve, and she began providing him with coconut oil. Vast amounts of coconut oil every day. She would mix it in with his porridge. She would, use his pretty standard diet. She began to incorporate a Mediterranean diet. So she researched nutrition and began still using bread and sourdough, but actually just incorporating more fish oils and brightly colored vegetables with high dose coconut oil. And within weeks, she noticed a huge improvement. And this has been documented as a case study by Dr. Veach. And so she began to notice changes in him and then began to incorporate MCT oil with the coconut oil. And at this point, his ability to draw a clock was just unbelievable. He could draw a clock. He drew all the lines, the numbers. And so he was then accepted onto a drugs trial. Now, this was a double-blind crossover trial. So he, for the first 12 months, unbeknown to Dr. Newman, was on a placebo. And he was improving month on month to the point where he got a job at the hospital helping with packaging. He was conversing again. He was explaining to her what it was like when his Alzheimer's was at its worst. He felt locked in. He couldn't read words on the pages anymore. And she felt like, in her own words, she had her husband back again. All of a sudden, his symptoms worsened dramatically. And she contacted the organizers of the trial and said, have you switched over? And they said, yes, we have. And she said, I want him out of the trial immediately. And it turns out that he was on she found out he'd been on the placebo, and then he was put onto the drug. And then the trial was ceased 4 months later because it was found that the drug accelerated Alzheimer's. And so he then worsened, and really the drug was still having a negative impact months after ceasing to take it. So then she was contacted by Dr. Veach, who's a ketone researcher, and he developed a ketone ester, which is a very potent form of ketones that can really raise the blood serum levels of ketones. And so he said, look, he'd be the first individual to try this. And she said, absolutely, let's go for it. He'd progressed to the point where he hadn't a great deal of time left, they believed. So she said, let's go for it. Anyway, within weeks of him going onto this ketone ester, he again reawakened these, and she describes it like these hibernating neurons wake up again. And it's just so interesting how ketones have the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier, and they can provide the fuel that these neurons that aren't able to use glucose anymore to access the geographical areas of the brain that are affected by Alzheimer's and other aging and neurodegenerative conditions such as Parkinson's and ALS. So she was so dumbfounded by this information that she'd come across, and witnessing her husband's transformation and researching into all of the other ketone researchers and the evidence that was presenting, that she wrote an article called "What if there was a cure for Alzheimer's and nobody knew about it?" And she documented the visuals, the clocks, all of the blood serum levels with the ketones that had been documented. And she booked a table at the Alzheimer's International Conference where there'd be 5,000 Alzheimer's researchers. And they wouldn't allow her to hand out her paper. They refused her a table, and they refused to let her discuss her case at all, which I found shocking, to be honest. So this paper that I have put forward for the listeners to read over it's giving some insight into the potential therapeutic benefits of ketones and a low carb diet, and allowing your body to go into ketosis, but also using foods such as coconut oil and MCT oil to really naturally elevate your own ketone levels, because there's also a link between insulin resistance associated with polycystic ovarian syndrome and brain fog, as we like to call it, impaired cognitive function, memory, anxiety. And if we can provide the fuel to the brain that becomes blocked when there's an issue with glucose uptake and glucose deficit, then we can start to overcome the issue that people, and I feel, again, this really ties in, Jen, with your food addiction paper. When we get that brain fog, when we get that lack of ability to focus, concentrate, and we need the lift, people turn to food. And ironically, turning to foods that actually drives blood sugars and worsens insulin resistance and leads on to sex hormone imbalances, polycystic ovarian syndrome, estrogen dominance. And we end up just in this vortex, particularly women with their sex hormone imbalances. We end up in this vortex that further down the line could potentially become a issue. And we don't know if insulin resistance or this hypometabolic state drives Alzheimer's, but we know certainly that it's there long before any clinical manifestation of Alzheimer's presents. So I'm particularly interested in this because of obviously my interest in the low carb diet, but I just think it's so important that people understand the implications of how they eat now and where that could lead them 10, 15. I mean, Alzheimer's is going to be an epidemic. It already is on the rise dramatically. But if we can start to see the link between high blood sugars and this hypometabolic state in the brain and how we can overcome that and even prevent us getting to that stage, but using ketones as the primitive fuel that they've always been, but that most of us never really get access to because we eat every 2 to 3 hours, then it can just have incredible benefits for our health and longevity.
Amazing. Thank you, Pauline. What a story. I was actually had an emotional reaction when you said that she was ignored. I was like, how can they do that when they've got, I know it's an N=1. However, like I think we come across on this podcast all the time, there are numerous N=1 stories.
Yes.
And actually they have a value to them. And the more that we get those stories out there, the more you realize that the dam will break eventually. But when people just say, almost patronizingly, just go home, nothing to do with you, we're the professionals, I get really angry by that. My blood boils.
And there's the physiological basis as to why that would happen. I mean, ketones have been researched since George Cahill discovered them way back in the 60s and discovered that the brain had this alternative source of fuel. So it's, the basis for them being used as a potential therapeutic medicine, if you like, it's already there. It's just not something that we're looking at. Even epilepsy, you guys will all know, epilepsy has been treated for, particularly historically, with the ketogenic diet. There's too much money to be made now to treat infantile spasms respond incredibly well to the ketogenic diet, but there's $250,000 to be made out of every child medically managed for that condition versus using a ketogenic diet, which is just as effective at managing their seizures.
But no profit to be made on it, exactly.
No profit to be made.
Jen, what did you want to say on that point?
Yeah, it was the thing that really leapt out. It's similar, Pauline, was when they say in the paper that this glucose uptake problem and the fact that ketones can still be used has been known since the early 1980s, if not before.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're just kind of thinking, it's such another epidemic, isn't it? So many people suffering, so many families suffering. It's just incredible, and it's such a simple possible solution. And David's going to say, but we certainly have 1 or 2 cases that are relevant, haven't we?
Go for it, David.
Well, I wanted to talk about nutrition of older people. Firstly, Pauline, I've seen that awakening. I remember one 86-year-old lady who in a nursing home, hadn't come out of her room for months, confused and lethargic. There was a clue, though, in the room because she was surrounded by bags of sweets as well as biscuits. And there were 3 puddings on the table in front of her because she'd ordered extra.
Wow.
And what was so wonderful, this was a woman I'd known for decades. And when we cut all the sugar, she just came alive, and the staff in the nursing home were amazed. She left the room. She started joining in. They have activities in the residence lounge, and to see that woman coming alive was very surprising.
Amazing.
And I think I'd like to talk a little bit about nutrition in nursing and rest homes. I'm a bit of a specialist in that because in Southport we have a very high elderly population, a lot of rest and nursing homes. And I think it isn't just there. I think a lot of older people, the diet is very carb heavy. It tends to be. They stop cooking for themselves, or it's an effort to cook for yourself, and it starts becoming biscuits and snacks and so on. But there's really no excuse for the rest and nursing homes. And I find that in there's a lack of protein, so that a lot of older people suffer from sarcopenia, which is a word of they lack muscle mass, and muscle mass is intricately linked with aging. And we need to preserve muscle mass for older people, both with exercise, but also relevant nutrition. A related thing, my sister is a registered dietitian. And she found in her area, the nursing homes were doing two things. One, skimmed milk with underweight people, but because they're underweight, they were giving them Ensure prescribed sugary drinks. So these elderly people were on one hand given skimmed milk in their tea and coffee and if they had milk. But on the other hand, they were given sugary drinks to try and give them extra weight. And the cost of these sugary drinks was tens of thousands of pounds. And all they actually needed to do was blend cream, double cream, with raspberries or something, or make trifle or whatever, because my sister discovered older people, if you ask them, don't enjoy the drinks. They were often just left to the side, and because they felt guilty, they drank a third of the sachet. They come in little cartons. But of course, if you're very overstressed in a nursing home, running a nursing home, it's very difficult to go around feeding people and so on. And also there isn't money for nutrition, but if they can get stuff prescribed, then it's win-win. But she saved, I think it was something like £80,000 for her area by educating the GPs. And she did this by getting them to drink those drinks themselves and say, is this what you would like to be forced to drink when you're old, or would you rather have raspberry trifle or something else? And I do a word for the elderly, a word for care in nutrition of the elderly. It makes a difference. It's not hopeless. That lady was 86. The oldest low carb I've done is 92 years old.
Wow.
Gardening. She's in her own home, and I rang her recently, and she was out busy in the garden, age 92.
That's incredible. Absolutely amazing. And can I just say that the argument that always comes up in relation to this is, but Dr. David, it's very easy for you to say, but the ketogenic diet is very expensive. But what you just said there was the opposite side.
Expensive.
The NHS is paying money to feed people sugar and rubbish. And actually, I know that in Tim in South Africa, you're actually helping communities who are certainly probably a lot more vulnerable than people in the UK to eat a lower carb diet. It's very much doable, isn't it?
Oh, indeed it is. It doesn't have to be expensive. We found that for 30 rands, which makes about £2, in fact, it's less than £2, people could eat quite well. It's not a fantastically tasty diet, but it's at least healthy. So yes, it can be done.
Yeah. And were you going to say something on that same point, Pauline?
I was going to say that even introducing time-restricted eating, I think if we take a step back prior to losing muscle mass, which women particularly are vulnerable to from about the age of 40 onwards, when you're a sugar burner and you're constantly using glucose for fuel, you are at risk of losing muscle mass, particularly year on year. And if we can start to adopt a more low carb, using ketones for fuels approach to our diet and lifestyle, we can preserve muscle mass, we can reduce insulin resistance, and the ketogenic diet it does not have to be expensive. It just comes down to basics: time-restricted eating, eat simple, colourful fruit and veg, wild meat, wild fish, quality protein, and ditch the sugar. It's not about eating keto bars and keto packaged food. It's about working with our physiology and providing our body the ability to burn the fuel that we carry that's on it and use the huge potential. The health benefits that ketones have are incredible. They're antioxidant, they're potent. They really help to disarm free radicals by donating their electrons. They help with insulin resistance. They are incredibly potent at reducing inflammation. But most people never get the chance to see their ketone levels rise because we eat so regularly and we're sugar burners. So, we can enter a state of mild ketosis just by not eating overnight and then eking out when we eat the next day to sort of 10, 11. It only takes 14 hours to deplete the glycogen in the liver to the point where we're going to be in mild ketosis.
Fantastic. And just a little plug there, actually, just for anyone who's interested. If you go onto the UK Low Carb Facebook group, we do actually have a fast starting on Sunday. If anyone's interested in fasting for anything from 16 hours to 5 days, you're more than welcome to join us. And we'll support each other every evening with a Zoom call. And we kind of do it as a community together, because I think the team is a really important dynamic when you're doing something like that together. So if you're interested in doing fasting, Pauline just alluded there to how you can do intermittent fasting, but also if you want to do longer fasting, then UK Low Carb Facebook group is certainly the good place to go to. Now, I'm just aware of the time, and I really want to get onto our final paper today, where I know two of my guests are the first author and the third author. So Dr. David Unwin, I'll hand over to you now. Can you introduce to us, please, your paper, its title, and also tell us more about it? And can I just say, Dr. David Oliver was on the big conversation on the 1st of January and talked about this actual paper. And to hear it from you is really special. So, go for it.
Well, I think the first thing this shows is not only do I lack scruples, unlike Professor Noakes, I'm also lazy. And the truth is that I'm afraid it's true. The reason I'm doing this paper is because I've been dead busy all week, and I thought, oh God, I can't. At least I know this, so that's something. I've no other excuse other than laziness and a wish to show off. So my paper, I've got it here. Insights from a general practice service evaluation supporting a lower carbohydrate diet in patients with type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, a secondary analysis of routine clinical data, including hemoglobin A1C, weight, and prescribing over 6 years. That's a very long title, isn't it? It's open access. In fact, the quick way to get that is just Google BMJ Nutrition and Unwin, and you'll soon be onto the paper. So let's begin with the problem that I had as a clinician, and the problem I had was that when I started in practice, we had 57 people with type 2 diabetes in 1986. By 2012, the same practice with the same number of people, we'd suffered an 8-fold increase in the number of people with type 2 diabetes. We had a pandemic. And the practical problem we had was that we had no extra money to care for this 8-fold increase. We had no more nurses. In fact, we had fewer nurses. So it was really very, very gloomy and very depressing, an 8-fold increase. And the other point was these people were younger. And it was just so depressing. And then, some of you know, I learned from one patient. This person had put her diabetes into remission, and I was fascinated. And we learned from that one patient. And just to bring you right up to date, we've now got 98 patients in drug-free type 2 diabetes remission. There was a lot of lessons learned, though, and it was important that we published what we did to try and help other people replicate what we did. Although to an extent this occurred because I was actually under fire for the low carb thing. So back in 2013, I was, as far as I knew, the only low carb GP in the UK. There was nobody else. And for the low carb work, I received hate mail and was shouted at in clinical meetings. Other doctors would get up and actually shout at me. For what I did was irresponsible, I should know better, etc. But those people did me a favor, because I realized that if I was a responsible clinician, I must collect data. And I'd say this to any other clinicians listening. If you're going to do something that your colleagues wonder about, collect data, because data is power. And thus it has turned out to be, because we were collecting data carefully from 2013, we have now a reasonably interesting, I think, database running all these years for all the patients right from the very beginning. And this was the basis of the paper you can now read. It's a very humble paper in a way, because it's only an audit. It's not an RCT, it's not a major work, it's just an audit. And we've audited, science is about interesting questions. And my question was, for people who choose a low carbohydrate approach, what happens to them? So we're just looking at the people who choose a low carbohydrate approach. And of course, it's quite correct to say that therein lies some of the fault lines within my work, because we're looking at people who choose a low carbohydrate approach. However, what is interesting is, in the practice, as the years go by, more and more of the population in my NHS practice are choosing a low carb approach. And as part of this, our results are getting better and better. And we've now got to a point where we've actually got drug-free type 2 diabetes remission for a fifth or 20% of the entire diabetic population of my practice, my 9,500 patients. And so we started off with that question of, well, what happens to individuals? But we're beginning now to have some of the answers for what might happen to a practice. And at the same time, interestingly, we found that we were saving quite large amounts of money on the drug budget. So that keeps increasing. So now, Norwood Avenue, my NHS practice, we spend £58,000 per year, less than is average for our area, on diabetes drugs alone. So these are huge savings of money. And we now have a wonderful situation where quite a number of other GPs in the UK have absolutely replicated what we did at Norwood Avenue. So this little bit of a chat, that's the start of it, but I'm also trying to bring you up to date with what has happened and draw some interesting conclusions. So if any of you look in the paper, you will see that we broke the population down into people with type 2 diabetes and people with pre-diabetes. Now, what is not discussed enough, in my opinion, is the amazing results that low carb achieves with those who have pre-diabetes. So that's a hemoglobin A1C, which is the blood test we do on sugariness of your blood, between 42 and 48. And what we found, we had 78 of those people who'd chosen the low carb approach, and they'd sustained it for about 2 years. But the amazing thing is 93% of them achieved a normal blood sugar, sorted. 93%. And let me tell you that a cure rate of 93% in medicine is very, very unusual. And it really warrants curiosity, at least. So what we found was 93% of the pre-diabetics achieved a normal blood sugar. They also improved lipid profiles, blood pressure. I published in a separate publication what happened to the liver function, which also improved. The people with type 2 diabetes, 46% of them achieved drug-free type 2 diabetes remission. I'm often asked, well, what happened to the other half? Did they die, or what happened to them? In fact, the half who didn't achieve remission achieved other things, very significant improvements in diabetic control. The average improvement in hemoglobin A1C, I think, was about 21 millimoles per mole, which is a lot, far more than drugs would achieve. But just to develop this a little more. So we were looking at the remission rates, and then we divided it down again. And this is going to be, I've got another publication coming out in about 3 weeks, and then the one after that is going to be on this subject. We stratified everybody with, well, how long have you had type 2 diabetes, and what result can you expect if you try low carb? And here was another surprise. For the people who chose a low carb approach within 1 year of diagnosis of diabetes, 76% of them can expect to get drug-free type 2 diabetes remission. And so there's something to be learned from this. So what you've got is people with pre-diabetes. Well, 93% of them can be sorted out. People with diabetes within 1 year, it looks like something like 76% of those can get drug-free type 2 diabetes remission. So the longer you have diabetes, it's a bit like Jen and her addiction. These things dig in rather. I think in a way your metabolism ages and it becomes harder to rescue people. But Jen and I always talk a message of hope. And the other thing was that there were people who achieved remission who'd had diabetes for 15 years. So there is still hope. And furthermore, in this particular paper, we showed that the best improvements in hemoglobin A1C are to be achieved with the people with the worst control of their diabetes. What a message of hope. So actually the worse the diabetic control, the highest hemoglobin A1C, they're my favorite patients because I get such dramatic results. They are less likely to achieve remission, but they are highly likely to achieve astonishing improvements in their diabetic control. And let's just go back to I think the thing that's common to Pauline and Tim, which is a high blood sugar is doing damage as a function of time. So the longer you have a high blood sugar, the more it's doing its damage. And so it is harder to reverse it all. And this really means that our priority should really be the young people in society because they become addicted. The youngest type 2 diabetic I've seen is 10 years old. That is terrible. That is a tragedy. What is the future of that young person? And at the moment, the very idea of low carb for young people is contentious, as Tim knows. And so, yeah, something about the young people, something about how it progresses, but also the idea of hope that even if you have very poorly controlled diabetes, you can make astonishing improvements. And we also, I just like to say a quick word about insulin and sodium. Insulin and sodium. It's been known since 1922 that insulin causes your kidneys to hoard salt that you would otherwise wee out. Since 1922. And so another one of my papers is to do with the astonishing improvements in blood pressure that I've discovered. And in part, but not completely, it's due to the fact that insulin causes you to hoard salt. So a high carb diet is a high insulin diet, is hoarding a lot of salt. When you go low carb, many of us notice the diuresis. We wee loads. You're losing a lot of salt and the blood pressure comes down. And a third of all my patients need to come off their blood pressure medication when they go low carb because they start feeling dizzy when they stand up, a thing that I experienced myself. So we're continuing to learn a lot from the cohort that Jen and I are looking after. What are some of the lessons? So another one is people need support long term. You can't, they're not, everybody is on a journey and they need support. Primary care is the perfect place for this. You know, I've looked after my patients for a long time. There's a lot of mutual trust. It's a wonderful way to look after your patients. They need support long term because of addiction. There's a thing called carb creep. And I've had many people who've needed to be rescued from carb creep. And again, I'd say it's usually somebody who's gaining weight who was previously low carb, somebody whose diabetic control is going off. It's not usually that the diet has failed. It's very often that they're no longer on the diet and they've started on biscuits or something. And I would always say, have you slipped? You know, where's that sugar come from? And then they go, oh, fair cop, you know, it's biscuits, it's whatever. But we should never be judgmental because this addiction is so hard. They need support and encouragement. What worked before probably work again. Why don't you do it again? Oh, and they do. And then it works. Marvelous. They need feedback and support. I think I'll make my final point now. What I think surprises me is the whole thing is so ridiculously simple. So I've said that for somebody with type 2 diabetes, a high blood sugar damages your circulation over time, and it damages the large circulation, that's strokes and heart attacks, and it damages the small circulation, and that's renal function and retinas and skin. So a logical place to begin is, well, what puts up my blood sugar? Oh, it's sugar. So don't have sugar. Oh, and starch makes sugar as well. So I'm a complete fraud because the whole thing is so ridiculously simple. But then again, it wasn't. How come? What's my excuse for all those years as a doctor prescribing? I can't think, because it is very simple. If you have type 2 diabetes, sugar is kind of a metabolic poison. I think Tim has said this. You shouldn't have a metabolic poison if you have type 2 diabetes. You should avoid it, really. And the results can be amazing. And I'm sometimes amazed that I should be paid for this at all, because people, I'm thanked, I'm hugged, all these things pre-COVID. And yet all I'm doing is saying, oh, sugar's bad for you because you have diabetes, and starch is sugar as well. I think that's enough from me now. I'll stop.
That's a wonderful amount. Thank you so much. And thank you to the work that you and Jen did together in that practice. And it just shows me that in a way we're getting medicine wrong in some regards, that it's about patching people up when they're broken, but actually you're coaching people. I know, Tim, you said that on the podcast before about the coaching will take over, where it's actually coaching lifestyle to avoid this in the first place.
Dan, yes. You touched on something so important there. We were before debating, like, what's gone wrong. I thought so much about, was I asleep? Was I mentally ill? What's my excuse for this? And somebody said to me once, we've got the wrong paradigm. And at that time, I didn't know what the word paradigm meant, but I do now. It's the whole system of the way we doctors think. And we tend to look at illness and then think, well, so we do tests to decide what's wrong with you. And then our first question is, what's the drug for what's wrong with you? And we have stopped thinking about the true cause of illness. Why is my patient ill? And if you start doing that and really engage with preventative medicine, that is the only logical solution to these pandemics. We can't keep medicating the world. We can't afford it, and in any case, it doesn't seem to work very well. And I had the wrong paradigm of care, and now my new paradigm is thinking about the cause of illness and swimming upstream of that.
Yeah, and the fact that I think there is a movement for change is really, in many ways, partly down to you too, but also you as well, Professor Tim Noakes, and the fact that, you have actually been attacked. And I think what David said earlier on about the hate that he had received, especially in the early days, and we know that, Tim, you had to face that even more so at a court case where, as you said, you're excommunicated, but worse than that, they were trying to attack your character. It was very much an ad hominem against you. And I think the fact that you've always stood strong, all of you, is a real testament to the movement now and how strong it's becoming. So is there anything anyone wanted to say about that particular story, the article, or wants to share generally? Over to you guys.
Just as an academic, I just can't praise David and Jen enough. To have done what they have done in their private practice it's astonishing. I can't praise them enough for having the foresight to do what they did and to collect the numbers and to measure the numbers so that they could come up with facts. Because that's why should they have done that? David's just said, he was wrong because he was treating patients wrong. Well, what made him change and what made him decide to actually measure the outcome of his intervention? Because that was the key. Yeah. Changing the intervention was important, but measuring it and wanting to publish papers and to change the world through science, why were you stupid enough to think you could do that?
No, Tim, that's so interesting, and I haven't told the whole story. So yes, it was the gamma GT results. I had people who'd had sky-high liver function for decades, and within weeks, those results improved so much, I was astonished. I was absolutely astonished by the improving liver function. And the more I looked, I remember keeping all the blood tests as a treat to process at the end of the day, because I couldn't believe that. Normally you do blood tests. So a quarter of my practice have abnormal liver function. So it's terribly common, but I was finding them improving rapidly. I was absolutely astonished. And after astonished, I realized I had an ethical imperative. If it was true, in fact, I was ashamed. The results were so good. I was wondering how to dumb them down to make it credible, because I thought nobody's going to believe this. And I would like to just publicly thank Professor Roy Taylor of Newcastle University, because, I didn't know what to do with this data that I had, but I knew it was really important. And I wrote to 20 professors, not including you, Tim. And of these great men, only one of them replied. And it was Roy Taylor from Newcastle. Not only did he reply, but he said what I was doing was important. And he did the statistics for me. I had no idea how to run an Excel spreadsheet or anything. And Roy Taylor did the stats, wouldn't allow himself to be, he's credited on the paper, but he wouldn't be one of the named authors. So it was astonishment. And then when you've started collecting data, it becomes addictive. Another addiction, because you think, is it true? Can it be true? And then I started very quickly thinking, well, I need to carry some other things. I wish I'd done ESR and CRP from the very beginning, because I think that would have been useful. But Tim, and thank you for your kindness. That means a great deal, because we are standing on your shoulders, your bravery. You took a great deal of flack for the rest of us. And I think because of what happened in your case, maybe the rest of us are a little safer. And I hope some lessons have been learned about how tenacious our community can be when under fire.
Fantastic. Can I just say as well, though, that this paper of yours, I know from Dr. David Oliver, from Dr. Kim Andrews, from many GPs I've spoken to, and this is what's given them the courage to say, wow, this is the basis. This is our foundation. We can work with this and we can go places with this, and we'll try it ourselves. And people have copied not only what you've done with your patients, but the data collection as a way to make sure they could back themselves up. So, being the leader in something, it's always really scary because you don't know where it's going to take you. And I think you two in particular, in your doctor's practice, and Tim in South Africa, you've done that. But it has now led the way for others. And I think that's incredible. And as I said at the beginning of the show, and I honestly want the show to be this, to be the kind of meeting place for the grassroots movements for change. And the more N=1 stories we can share, the more we can hear from people like yourselves who experience this at an academic level, at a practice level on the front line, the more we can encourage other people to make the change in their lives and support them. And actually, that's the thing. It's support, isn't it? Us coming together to say, well, I've got this knowledge and I've got this story and I can help you there. And just want to say, before we get into more big conversation, the comments have been really amazing coming in from people. And there's too many to share the time we have. But I just want to say, this is where I love this community, because it is so positive. Just to put Yvonne on very quickly, pretty sure my diabetes was undiagnosed for years, A1C 108. Now, I'm not a doctor or medically trained, so you can tell me what this is. But it went to non-diabetic in about 8 months with keto.
And that makes the point, Dan, of what I was saying about those. So that's a very high hemoglobin A1C. So diabetes is diagnosed at 48. So somebody with 108, that would normally have clinicians panicking and prescribing. So there may be a brave clinician there, but yes, it makes the point. Those with the most sugar benefit most by cutting sugar.
Yeah, fantastic. I know Ken Armstrong as well. He's here. He very much talks about in the past sleep apnea and how it affected every single part of his life. And actually, you know, there's so many things that I think people say, oh, that's the obesity. But actually now we're realizing it's the metabolic syndrome at the cause of all of this that's affecting so much of the damage we have. Now, less from me, because I realize I'm the most boring person here. So I want to hear from you guys. Anything else before we wrap up today? Anything anyone wants to say about that article or about anything else in particular? Over to you.
May I just add, this is my final point, Jen, and then of course you must go next.
Gas.
I chucked everything into that, or Jen and I, we all chucked everything into that paper. So in it is the diet sheet. If you go to the supplementary file, that's enabled me to chuck even more in there. So there's the nurse protocol, the prescribing figures. So it is worth, particularly if you're a clinician, it's worth looking at the supplementary file, because I've done my best to make it easier for you to start offering this approach to your own patients.
There you go. Fantastic. Jen, did you want to say something before the other Dr. Unwin cut in there?
Rudely cut in. Just the lovely links between all the papers that we brought, even though, you know, they seem kind of different on the surface. And that one about the major one is about early prevention, isn't it? Because everyone's been saying the longer these high blood sugars are going on, the more damage has been done to all the systems, you know, the brain, the gut, the heart, the liver, you know, so that's something we all need to really think about is, you know, helping families, helping young people, getting that information out there so that people can, you know, take action for themselves and be supported to do it. I think that's the thing that's really come across to me today.
Fantastic. Tim?
Yeah, I've just had the privilege of writing the foreword for Dr. Kraft's book. It's on diabetes. Dr. Kraft was the first person to start measuring insulin at the same time that the glucose tolerance test was performed. And he did something like 15,000 glucose tolerance tests with insulin. And then he wrote up the book, and Catherine Crofts from New Zealand has written articles about the work. And, you know, how long have I been studying diabetes? 10 years. I was still ignorant. And I was ignorant of one very key point, was that in 1975, Dr. Kraft described the condition of occult diabetes in situ. And he showed that only 25% of people with a normal glucose tolerance test do not have hyperinsulinemia. So he said hyperinsulinemia is type 2 diabetes. And I actually was in discussion with Catherine a few weeks ago, and she made the point that I'd made another error. I assumed that once you have type 2 diabetes, your insulin secretion is now abnormal in response to glucose tolerance tests. In other words, it'll be very low. And she said, no. The majority of people with type 2 diabetes are still secreting plenty of insulin. And they don't have a pancreatic failure. The pancreas is still able to secrete quite a lot of insulin, but obviously not enough. And so it's the fact is that type 2 diabetes, as soon as you have hyperinsulinemia, that is diabetes in situ. And that occurs long before your blood glucose is abnormal in response to glucose tolerance test. And that's a message we need to get out to the general public, but also to the doctors. We have to test insulin when we do a glucose tolerance test. And that will identify an enormous number of extra people who have pre-diabetes. And as David and Jen were saying, it's so easily reversible. If you just got hyperinsulinemia, it must be dead easy to reverse.
Very powerful. Thank you so much. Anything anyone wants to say just before we wrap up today? Go for it, Dr. D.
Just again, Tim, I love Roy Taylor's work, and as part of that, he describes the long silent scream from the liver. Yeah. And he's saying you've got about 10 years of liver problems before you get insulin resistance. And of course, this is marked by high triglycerides, central obesity, abnormal liver function. And we do not listen for this scream. We're not most clinicians do nothing at all. And there are signs there. And that's why fatty liver disease is 25% of the developed world, double diabetes, the long silent scream from the liver.
Very true. And how many of us now, I'd love to know the numbers, have this exactly happening at the moment. Just 2 more points. Lovely one here from Jeff, who's a good friend of mine. We had a guy in his 70s come up to us at the BBC Good Food show a few years back and mentioned how he uses MCT oil to assist with his Alzheimer's. That's your story there that you were sharing with us earlier on, Pauline. It was such a beautiful, humbling conversation. So it is obviously happened with some people. Felix has said, discovering keto 6 years ago has saved my health. It started with the book Sweet Poison, and that led me to Tim and the low carb community. I hadn't realized how addicted to sugar I was. Thank you so much. And there's so many comments coming through. I can't share all of them. What I will say before I just sign off today is that if you want to yourselves read these articles, there is a link that we can just share on the screen now. It's to the website that I've put this page onto. And that is where you're going to find that. It's literally guiltfree.com, pages links. And it's got there the link to these articles. You can find them, download them, have a read yourself. I just want to say, though, a massive thank you to my panel today. Thank you to Dr. David, Dr. Jen, to Pauline, and to Prof. Tim Noakes for coming on the show. It's been great to have you all here. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Big Conversation and that you'll come back another time. And I'd also like to thank all of you listening and all of you watching today, because wherever you are in the world, wherever you are watching this from and whatever platform you're on, we're all united. And I think that's what I've really had a strong feeling of today. We're united in a common cause for a common goal, and that is for the ultimate, I suppose, better lifestyle for most human beings on this planet. So thank you so much to you. And on that note, I just want to say a big goodbye. So bye, everyone. Take care of yourselves.
Bye.
Wherever you are in the
Thanks
world.
so much.
Bye now.
Bye.